Let's talk about a positive aspect of all this, about our country kind of going this way. As hard as it is to see something positive, there is positive in it. There are places where you and your family can go and still be free, still live the life your parents got to live and your grandparents got to live. It might involve a moving van, it might involve 100-degree temperatures and some mosquitoes in the summertime, but you can go to places like Florida, where Ron DeSantis has been fortifying for years now. Joining me now, Governor Ron DeSantis. Of course, you know who he is, author of the book, The Courage to Be Free. Governor, it was stunning to me. This, of course, came to the forefront during COVID when I would travel. My wife and I would travel around the country for various things. And you'd go to New York City, and it was like a zombie apocalypse. And we'd go down to Florida to have a vacation with the boys. And everyone's happy. Everyone's open. Everything's having a good time. And we're looking around thinking, gosh, we have to move here. How'd you do that?
Well, the thing about it is there was such a hysteria at that time. And I had never, obviously I'd only been governor for a year. No governors had really experienced a major pandemic. And I just started to say, okay, it's one thing to have Fauci and these people saying this, but what is actually happening on the ground? And what it seemed to me is after, 4 or 5 weeks of this, I'm like, these policies are not the right policies. You've got to keep things going. You've got to have kids in school. You got to protect people's rights to make the best decisions for themselves. So we went down that road to much attacks. People in the media, especially, were relentless. And I probably got attacked more on that than anything I've ever done. And yet, after the kids are in school, after our theme parks were open. I mean, we had Universal Studios open 6 weeks into COVID, 8 weeks into COVID. Life went on. And I thought, well, people are going to see this. Aren't all these other jurisdictions just going to follow suit? And what happened was places like New York, Chicago, California, places in the Pacific Northwest, they clung to unscientific, draconian COVID policies for years. Whether that was business restrictions, mask mandates, vax mandates, school closures, and it really helped destroy some of these societies. And I can tell you, just in Florida, we've always had people that have moved from the Northeast, moved from the Midwest. But when I started seeing license plates from California, when we'd see people flooding in from Washington State and Oregon, that's a pretty big move to move all the way across the country. You knew that it was just a radically different approach. And I remember I would always see people who would land at the airport during those days in Florida who had been in those jurisdictions. And it was almost like they were flying into West Berlin at the height of the Cold War. It was just totally, totally different. And I think that if you look at Florida, we've led the nation in in-state migration every year since I've been governor. Those areas are all losing people, and some for the first time, like California. Part of it is the COVID insanity they inflicted on their people. Part of it is not attending to the rule of law. We're very tough on that in Florida, and our crime rate's at a 50-year low. Part of it is education. Parents don't want the indoctrination in the schools, and we've stood strong against that. So for all those factors, we've really been, since I've been governor, a refuge of sanity in a world gone mad.
Governor, I'm glad you brought up the rule of law, because this Jeffrey Epstein stuff has always bothered me quite a bit. Obviously, not just the horrible crimes and the innocent women, but that the powerful people so oftentimes just get away with things. The people who aren't powerful, who don't hold any positions or money, they get trampled on, and powerful people get away with things. So is that why you're doing what you're doing? What are you doing with these Epstein documents that we've all wanted to see for so long?
Well, just as you said, I mean, this happened obviously decades ago. This came to a head legally in 2006 through 2008, so long before I was governor. And what ended up happening is there was this really opaque deal that was struck with federal prosecutors in the Southern District of Florida to route the case through Palm Beach County. And then he got this sweetheart sentence for really relatively minor offenses compared to what he actually did. And this was something that has obviously been a major problem because he had a lot of wealth. He lived in one of the wealthiest enclaves in the United States, a lot of connections. And so you have all these victims that never received justice. So fast forward, I became governor. I launched a criminal investigation into how this happened to where he was given this slap on the wrist. what happened, though, is our investigators were running in to grand jury rules. Grand jury material is secret in the state of Florida, like most states. And so they weren't able to have access to that. So we needed to change Florida law in order to be able to open up the Epstein grand jury material. And so the legislature finally passed a bill for me to sign, which says, and this is relatively rare situations, but a situation like Epstein, that the public does have a right to have that grand jury material disclosed. So they are going to do that. The bill's effective July 1st. I signed it in Palm Beach. We had some of the victims were there with us. I mean, these are women now that are in their late 30s, but they were like 13, 14, 15 when this was happening back decades ago. So and the thing is, what they said is that they're just like, thank you, because we've never gotten any closure at all on any of this because of the way it's been handled. So I think that this will be important for the public. I think people have a right to know. And here's the thing. Ghislaine Maxwell is in prison in Florida from federal charges, but she's actually housed in a Florida federal prison. And Epstein, how his demise happened, we can only talk about another time, but he's gone. Nobody else has been held accountable. Nobody. Are you kidding me? This whole thing has been going on in Florida, New York City, the Virgin Islands, and you have one person in jail and another one's deceased, and that's it. So that'll be good. But what I also said is the federal government should release all of its Epstein files. And Joe Biden has the ability to do that. He should do. And if he needs legislation, he should go to Congress and ask them to legislate the release. But my sense would be, hopefully we'll get some answers with what Florida's doing. But I think there's a lot of stuff in the federal government's possession because they were involved in multiple jurisdictions. And as we know, justice was never adequately served in this case.
No, it's certainly not. I can't imagine why a hands-on guy like Joe Biden would want those files kept secret. But let's move on and talk about another set of groomers, the Disney World thing. Governor, it breaks my heart. 10 years ago, I took my family down to Disney World, obviously. We had a blast riding the rides. It's freaking Disney World. It's part of America. And now you get to go to Disney World and watch princesses who have beards there. They decided they wanted to teach your second grader about sex. What happened, and what did you do to these people?
Well, Jesse, I agree with you. I grew up in Florida, and we lived for a time. I actually lived in the Orlando area as a young kid for a couple years, where we were going, based on where my dad was working at the time. And back then, as a Florida resident, you'd go to a park for like $15, and I'd go to Magic Kingdom. That back then it was just Magic Kingdom and Epcot, but you'd go. I rode all the rides. I did so many times. And it's just something that was important for our state and really an all-American brand. We had a bill a couple years ago in Florida to protect kids and to protect the rights of parents when it comes to indoctrination in the classroom with the sexual matters like transgenderism. And we took a position to just say, we're not going to be telling elementary school kids that their gender is a choice. We're not going to be getting involved into teachers prying into these types of matters. And I think that is something that the overwhelming percentage of parents agreed with. Disney, for whatever reason, decided to fight us on that, came out opposed to the bill, tried to kill the bill. A lot of people thought I would have to veto the bill just because they're the 800-pound gorilla in Florida politics, and no one really goes against them. But, I'm a dad. I've got young kids. I got a first grader, I've got a kindergartner, and I got a preschooler. And it's sad to say, but as a parent, I now have to be concerned if they put on a Disney program, what may be trying to shove down their throat. That was not true when I was a kid. It's certainly not consistent with Walt's vision. But that, unfortunately, what's happened. And, we basically were in a situation where they were pledging to overturn our law. They were going to sue on it. They were going to do all this, which, look, I don't think a publicly traded company should be getting involved in this. But if they want to do that, fine. However, they had all these special privileges that they had built up over many decades, which is effectively the biggest corporate welfare scheme in all of America. And so we undid that. We took that away and said, you know what? You're not going to be able to have this corporate cronyism where they actually control the local government entirely. in Central Florida. So this is the 1-year anniversary of us imposing a state control board over this district, local government in Central Florida. And the media, when we did this, said, oh, it's going to be so bad, all this other stuff. None of what the critics said have come to pass. I had all these even establishment Republicans attacking me over this. What has actually happened is the district has cut taxes for all the tenant businesses in the district, about $12 million in savings. And then they've opened up bidding for district projects competitively. So now local businesses in the Orlando area can compete and get jobs. And so it's a difference between operating a local government in the best interest of the citizens rather than allowing one corporation to control it for its own personal interest. And so it's an example of good governance that we were able to unwind Disney's special privileges. And you know what? 4 or 5 years ago, nobody would have thought that was possible in the state of Florida.
Governor, wrapping this up, you were talking about Walt Disney, and it's fascinating to me how many of these wealthy titans throughout history, not just American, how many of their kids turn out to be useless commie scum, from the Fords and Walt Disney's to, the Che's parents. What is it about wealth and power as a parent that it makes your child more likely to be a piece of trash?
Well, I think you raise an interesting question. If you look at some of these foundations, like the Ford Foundation, some of these others, where it really fell from great industrialists of the past, and now you go a few generations forward, and they are funding massive funding of hard left causes that are functionally anti-American and anti the values that allowed their families to accumulate that wealth in the first place. I've said that those organizations are things that we should look at for scrutiny, because they get massive tax benefits. They don't really pay taxes, and yet they're really having a major political impact. It's interesting. When I was going through school, college and law school, I was in some of these so-called elite institutions, and I was a working class kid. I was a baseball player. A lot of the kids that I played baseball or that were on the football team that I knew from college came from more blue-collar, middle-class families, and they were all very pro-American. The folks that had been legacies from these universities or came from some of those multi-generational families of wealth, they tended to be the ones who were the most anti-American and were most left-wing in their activism. So it's interesting because they would fashion themselves as like standing up for the working people. Yet I was one of those working people making minimum wage jobs to skate through. And I actually believed in the values of this country, and they had benefited so much from it, and they turned their back on it.
Governor, appreciate you very much. I'm glad you're there. We'll be moving there shortly, I'm sure. Thank you, sir.